Good afternoon, everybody. Some folks are going to be coming in. I hear we're parking sort of impacted on campus. And those of you who know university campuses know that that there's nothing that faculty and staff don't talk about more than the parking situation. And because of all the construction on campus and stuff, it's become even tighter. So we're sorry that some people have had trouble. I'm thinking of a way to make it a little easier for people for the next meeting, for people coming from off campus. So I want to welcome you all to the Andrus Gerontology Center, Leonard Davis School of Gerontology. Many of you know, but I'll just mention for those who may not, this is the oldest and largest and one of the few schools of gerontology in the world. The school was founded 34 years ago by Leonard Davis, and prior to that, AARP established the building and helped build it, and this enterprise called the Andrus Gerontology Center. And so the two are sort of interlinked entities, and they're basically one and the same. Our school being at USC, is a research-oriented professional school. It trains practitioners, it trains basic scientists, and blends the two in an interdisciplinary way that is very important in the study of a field as complex as gerontology. And I think some of these interlocking themes, I believe, will become quite evident to you in the presentation of our honored guest today. The nature of this lecture series, of which this is the third out of 6, we have another one next week, is that AARP is celebrating its 50th anniversary, as many of you know, and their board decided that it would be nice to have a lecture series somewhere in the country to help honor AARP, to help them celebrate, and happily they thought of us first as the best university location for their distinguished lecture series. So we're very grateful to AARP, very happy that they, as another sign of this good relationship that we've had with each other over these many years. It's a particular honor to have as our speaker today Dr. Robert Butler. The word icon is often overused, but it's absolutely appropriate in the present instance. The field of gerontology and the name and work of Robert Butler and ongoing work of Robert Butler are inseparable. Just briefly, he is currently president and CEO of the International Longevity Center and also professor of geriatrics and adult development at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in that little city somewhere in the Northeast Corridor. He is a gerontologist and a psychiatrist. He's appeared in front of the U.S. Congress. He's conducted hundreds of interviews with the media. He's worked for decades to push population aging into the public discussion arena, which is very important. He's helped recognize discrimination against older adults. He coined the term ageism, and he foresaw early on the impact that aging would have on society, and some of those themes I know he'll be addressing in his presentation today. He is, to those in the field, perhaps best known and honored for being the founding director of the National Institute on Aging, one of the institutes of the National Institutes of Health. And he's founded the first, I believe this is correct, the first U.S. Department of Geriatrics at Mount Sinai. One of his books he'll be talking about today, Longevity Revolution, an earlier book, Why Survive Being Old in America, won him the Pulitzer Prize in 1976. Now, it's amazing to win a Pulitzer Prize anyway, But for an academic to win a Pulitzer Prize is particularly extraordinary because academics often write in somewhat abstruse fashion. I don't know whether we learn it or whether we're selected for it or whether being in a university setting does it to us. But I find it, as someone who tries to write clearly, I find it amazing that he won this prize. He's done so many other things, but this one, personally for me, is utterly fantastic. So he will be talking, ending around 1:45, and we'll have some Q&A, and then afterwards, around 1, we'll those of you who RSVP'd, be having a lunch in the patio. It'll be a little brisk out there, but it won't be wet because it'll at least be covered. So I hope you'll be warm enough eating out there. And well, I'll be trying to take him outside soon after 1 o'clock as possible. So having said these things, it's a great honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Robert Butler.
Thank you, Jerry. It's a great pleasure to be back here at this wonderful institution, which I have a long relationship with, beginning with Jim Beeren many years ago, because he's my oldest collaborator. We began to work together in 1955. And then Ed Snyder, one of the remarkable things I think about this great institution is you've only had 3 leaders, to my knowledge, which is quite remarkable over its long and healthy and vibrant span of life. And so I have Jerry in my life, I have Ed Snyder in my life, and I have Jim Beeren in my life. And it's a great pleasure to be here today and to talk to you about my newest book, The Longevity Revolution, which I endeavor within it to summarize some 50 years of thinking about this field and to see if I could synthesize my own experience. And to look at it not just from the medical point of view, but the cultural, socioeconomic, and political perspective, and also to address an extraordinary paradox. Now, on the one hand, we have this great increase in life expectancy. At the same time, we have all the gloomy gusses who somehow don't think we can afford it. Then I wanted to deal with a lot of misinformation and myths and offer some genuine solutions to such challenges as Social Security and Medicare, and to provide a kind of agenda for action. Now, I know everybody in this room is well aware of the fact that in the last century, the 20th century, we gained an extraordinary 30 additional years of life. Unheard of. Just to give you a little sense of it, in 1776, the founding of our country, the average life expectancy was only 35. And by 1947, and now 77. This is greater gain than had been attained during the preceding 5,000 years of human history. And women finally began to outlive men, which appeared to be their natural disposition, but because of well, they deserve to also. They deserve to live long. But, they had childbirth fever and childbirth death. And then we've also had a decline of disabilities because we don't want to just live long, we also want to live well. So that means there's been an increase in quality of life. And for those that think that this gain in life expectancy is exclusively or predominantly due to the massive reductions in deaths from maternity, childhood, and infant mortality, should know that nearly 20% is actually from age 65 on. There's been a 60% reduction in deaths from heart disease and stroke, for example, since 1960. Forgive my voice today, but California is cold and damp. The lady is a tramp. So we can't afford old people. They're only going to cause economic stagnation. They're going to lead to intergenerational conflicts. They are beset by chronic illness, particularly those over 65. We have this huge entitlements issue, and we're confronted with age prejudice. So I'm going to try to deal with a few of these ideas and to just pick upon a few topics that I selected from my book, those that I thought might be particularly provocative and interesting to you. One is the increasing realization on my part, now I've got my clinician's hat on, is that many of the diseases we think of as related to old age actually had their beginning early in life. And I don't just mean genetic. I mean also behavioral, lifestyle, and environment. For example, if we look at the early life history, genetic, environmental, behavioral, even low birth weight has been shown by Barker to be associated with heart disease. Then there are, of course, the polygenic disorders, survival, marvelous survival as a contribution to neonatology, but then also the lifelong exposures. But I particularly want to draw your attention to the remarkable views of Sir Peter Medawar, that aging itself is a function of the accumulation of deleterious genetic components throughout life. And the Gompertz curve, which we tend to forget about, which was the contribution of Benjamin Gompertz in 1825, a London actuary who described what he called the force of mortality, which has to do, as I like to think of it, as the outer manifestation of the molecular and biological changes that occur with aging. It predisposes to age and disease and reduce our defensive capabilities and our repair capabilities. Just two examples of diseases that we think of related primarily to old age, but which really are pediatric diseases. Tragically, whenever there's an autopsy done on a toddler in America, you're apt to already see atherosclerotic plaques. That is the fatty deposits that are associated with heart disease and stroke. In osteoporosis, we more and more realize that if young women, because it particularly affects older women more than men by about 85% to 15%, that if you've laid down your bone during pubescence and adolescence, banked your bone, unless you become alcoholic or smoke too much or other problems emerge, you're not likely to get osteoporosis. I said I wanted to give a scattering of various important topics that I think are neglected and not as much thought about. Most people think of suicide, they think of young people, as they should. It's horrifying. But to realize that although older people make up 12% of the population, they account for 25% of all the suicides, that the greatest suicide rate is among white men in their 80s, and that older people in general commit suicide at a greater rate than young people. It's very important to know that because as a clinician or as a family member, if an older person seems a bit depressed or whatever, it's something to be taken very seriously, especially among men, because when they decide to commit suicide, they're likely to do it with a gun in their mouth or whatever. They're very serious about it. They are not as apt to make actions, but more apt to actually have it happen. And then I wanted to bring to attention how little we understand about Social Security, which I think is the fault of the Democratic Party, out of which Social Security emerged, and a failure of the Social Security Administration. Most people think of it as a retirement program. It's not a retirement program. It's a program for survivors and disabled. 4 million children are covered under Social Security. The children of parents who lost their lives at 9/11 in New York are covered by Social Security. Social Security is the only program that's never failed. As you all know, private pensions have frequently failed. Municipal pensions probably are now going to fail unless something dramatic happens. Social Security is always paid off. It's also inflation-proof. Very few pension systems that are. Social Security provides more life insurance and more disability insurance than the private insurance industry provides. These, I think, are important facts that we really should understand. Had we privatized Social Security several years ago, what would have happened today, especially with those who at 62 might have been deciding to get their Social Security, only to find that it being privatized, they not only have their 101Ks that were once 401Ks, but are going to have a Social Security system that's broke. Social Security, as our new president indicated during his campaign, is actually relatively easy to fix. If we were to move up the ceiling, and by the way, there's only one tax in America that has a ceiling, and that's the Social Security wage base. No other tax has a ceiling. The ceiling is now $102,000. If it were moved up to $150,000, that would only affect 6% of the population, more affluent people like me and others that might be in this room. And that would solve 60% of the solvency issue of Social Security. And then by working longer also makes a huge difference. Some years ago, in 1979 to be precise, Congressman Gephardt Stockman, involving me in hearings in Washington in 1979, brought in Social Security actuaries, and it was quite amazing. Just having people remain in the workforce some months or a year longer meant more money in the system, less money out of the system. And we know from studies we did at NIH in the 1950s and 60s that people who work longer do better, live longer, and better. There's a value to having a purpose in life, something to get up for in the morning, something that makes a difference. Of course, we now are confronted with a huge economic downfall, and the question of discrimination in the workplace is going to emerge again because many older people are not going to be able to retire, or they would feel they were not going to be able to retire. So the retiring baby boomers is a huge issue. And it's a huge issue for some very practical reasons. Half of our nurses are going to be retired within the next 10 to 15 years. An aging society and a retirement of nurses, a shortage of nurses. And of course we have a looming shortage of primary care physicians. In our country, only 30% of doctors are in primary care compared to Europe, which runs 50%. There's some reasons for that, of course, I hasten to add. For example, an average medical student graduates with $140,000 worth of debt. The average graduate of a medical school in Europe had a free education, no charges at all for their medical education. So it's very tempting to join a procedural specialty to get $400 or $500 to do a colonoscopy, as opposed to maybe $100 spending an hour and a half with an older patient. So reality is present there. We also have a growing shortage, and will have in these next years with the impending retirement of the baby boomers, a reduction of executive and managerial talent, air controllers, atomic energy personnel. Now that data that I presented here is actually a little outdated because it was related to a conference which our center, the International Longevity Center, held with the Metropolitan Life Corporation, concerned about the impending retirement of baby boomers. And in the room in this major conference in Washington were all the big Fortune 500 companies. Now, of course, the situation is quite different in terms of what might be available and whether a lot of these people that would have retired will retire. But I think the biggest issue of all that confronts the country is really health care. I take that back. The biggest issue is the economic issue. But a subsidiary huge issue is health care. But most of the discussion has had only to do with financial aspects of the medical system. That's not enough. We need major structural reform. We need a seamless relationship between acute care, chronic care, end-of-life care. We really need to be aware of the lack of training of our workforce. For example, Great Britain, every medical school has a department of geriatrics. As Jerry pointed out, Mount Sinai was the first. We now have only 11 departments of geriatrics in 145 medical schools. 11 departments. The number of applicants for fellowships in geriatrics is declining, in part for the financial reasons I mentioned earlier. Great Britain, it's the second largest specialty, is geriatrics. So here we have an aging society, as I have said, and we have a declining availability of the people to take care of older people. But it not only applies to doctors and nurses, but I want to particularly point out the caregiving aspects. Those home health aides, wonderful people, often with big hearts, but poorly taken care of. They usually do not get pensions. They, even though they're part of the healthcare system, may not even have health benefits. In New York City, the visiting nursing service gets $19.50 an hour for a home health aide who herself, and it's usually herself, gets $7.50 or $8.50, not the full $19.50. They are not well taken care of. And they're usually minority, they're usually poor, they're often immigrant women, and they are the essence of the idea that we want to stay at home for as long as possible. They're the essence of what's called aging in place. But if we don't have a properly trained and effective home health aide workforce, where are we? And in many states, there's very modest certification. Some states, they barely check whether the individual has a criminal record. There's great need for outstanding training of these people to be able to recognize untoward drug reactions. In many states and jurisdictions, they cannot give drugs, and yet that's critical to the maintenance of the family with the mother or whatever off to work. They have very little career ladder opportunity. We have a significant grant from the Metropolitan Life Foundation where we're working with 24 community colleges to see if we can provide career ladder opportunities for these people to move up to become a CNA, a certified nurse assistant, or an LPN. Or maybe they'd like to become a radiology technician. But we've got to give them dignity, and we've got to give them a chance to grow because the retention of these people is not high. Now, the other side of it, of course, is if we begin to treat these people as we should, then the issue of affordability by the American family comes up. So I think we've got to have to face the music and to look overseas, to look to Germany, to look to Japan, where they have public long-term care systems of direct care paid for by government or through insurance funds. Not for-profit insurance funds, but non-for-profit insurance funds. We need to match the affordability issue for the American family, if they do want to remain at home for as long as possible, with a realistic treatment of the people that sustain the care. Third is hospitals and doctors do not get paid for providing health promotion and disease prevention. You make money on sickness. We don't have a healthcare system. We have a sickness system. So there's no real incentive, and certainly when doctors today have about 12 minutes per meeting with a patient, they're not going to be dealing with counseling with respect to alcohol or tobacco or whatever, or exercise. Chronic disease management was mentioned in the political campaign, and it's a huge issue because about 75% of all health costs relate to chronic disease, particularly with rising obesity, with diabetes, with heart disease, stroke, and other problems. Chronic disease is a huge, huge problem. We have about 24 million diabetics and twice as many pre-diabetics in the United States. We are now the heaviest nation in the world. And a few of us a few years ago wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine in which we predicted that as the present trends go, we could lose 3 to 5 years of that 30-year gain of life expectancy in the 21st century. And that this could be the first generation, the young generation, who live less long than their parents, losing ground because of the toxic food environment in which our children and ourselves live. And we have not devoted resources in recent times to research and development. There's been a 23% drop in support of the National Institutes of Health. And the average age of a scientific investigator supported by the NIH today is 41. And the average age of a new investigator, is 51. And of a new investigator is 42. We're killing young people's ability to go into science. It's a huge loss, one we can ill afford. I was very happy to see the stimulus package announced yesterday is going to include $3.5 billion for the National Institutes of Health. Very good news indeed. Not where it should be, because it should be higher, but it's a huge step from the reduction that we've experienced over the last few years. We also do not deal with drug safety in this country. We're so happy to push drugs rapidly on the market. And for reasons of compassion, I understand that. But on the other hand, on average, only 3,000 people are tested before a drug goes on the market. You need a 30,000 patient database to pick up liver toxicity, which is the main reason a drug gets withdrawn. We get into the Vioxx problems and other problems. We have many problems of drug reaction in this country. And one estimate from one meta-analysis, and you really should be shaken by this figure, that 100,000 people die every year from drugs. I'm not talking about a false administration, mistake in dosage. I'm talking about just dying from the use of a medication. 100,000 deaths per year. We do not have an adequate post-marketing surveillance system. It's based on reporting, and it's estimated that only about 10% get reported by families, by individual patients, or by doctors. And part of it is that people don't know the mode of action of how a drug works. Lipitor, for example, and the statins can cause serious muscle problems. But that wasn't understood right away. It took some time. So we need to have in place in each of our 10 districts, regions within our Department of Health and Human Services, competitive bids that will lead to the establishment within medical centers of programs that would be modeled very much after what's called the Boston Drug Surveillance Program, where you can really begin to properly monitor by having pharmacoepidemiologists, pharmacists, endocrinologists, neurologists, and others in a team that would monitor the introduction of drugs, all drugs, outpatient and inpatient. And by the way, that should include drugs that were never tested for effectiveness. Many drugs were only tested eventually for adverse reactions, but not for effectiveness. And we don't realize the drug goes on the market on a relative relationship between benefit and adverse reaction. It doesn't mean when a drug goes on the market that they're free of adverse reactions. It just refers to that ratio. And drug safety has not been a significant part of the present discussion. And yet 100,000 deaths puts it within the top 4 or 5 causes of death from therapeutic medications. When you think of the wonders of statins, of antihypertensive medications, and antibiotics, you just don't think of medicines as being a problem. And I've already mentioned caregiving. So we need to have a very different approach, in my judgment, to the health care discussion. And we have to realize how much money we spend. This chart was 2002, but now we're up to $7,000 per capita per year of cost for medical care. Look how different we are from those other countries. And yet we have very real questions about the quality of care. And now I am talking about mistakes, procedural mistakes in hospitals, drug misprovisions based on dose or even the proper medicine. We have a rule in my family, and I would recommend you all have it in yours. Any family members in a hospital, a family member should be in that hospital 24 hours a day. When the nurse comes with a medication, what is the medication you're giving my mom now? What is the dosage you're giving her? Because the estimates out of the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Science, is that somewhere between 48,000 and 96,000 people die every year from mistakes in drug administration, from mistakes in doing a procedure, or for what are called hospital-based infections. So our hospitals are not so clean, and we doctors don't always wash our hands between patients, and we should. The other, in the scattering of selected topics I wanted to bring up, was to look at the actual causes of death. This is different from looking at cause of death based on diagnosis, where you would have heart disease, cancer, and stroke in that order. It's looking at the underlying basis for it, and to realize that although we've had a 50% reduction in smoking since the Surgeon General's report in 1964, we still have over 400,000 people who die related to smoking. It's the number one preventable cause of death in the world. Butler, former Prime Minister of Norway and former head of the WHO, helped negotiate a treaty, worldwide treaty, to deal with tobacco because it is the number one preventable cause of death throughout the world, not just the United States. I won't go into the poor diet and activity. I think you all know that very well. But I would like to stress the problem of alcohol in this country, which is a very neglected topic. We have about 16 million hardcore alcoholics in the United States. 1 out of every 4 American families is affected by alcohol. 20% of all highway fatalities are related to alcohol. Most abuse within families, if you're studying abuse within families, you really have to be studying alcohol. Alcohol is very primary in child abuse, spouse abuse, elder abuse. A very serious problem. One of the reasons that the tobacco smoking was reduced pretty dramatically was not just education, but also taxation. That has not happened with the liquor industry. They have been so powerful. In fact, since the 1950s, there have only been 2 increases in liquor taxes. Liquor taxes used to be a significant part of federal revenues, not anymore. The liquor lobby is so powerful, but we're going to have to address it if we're serious about health promotion and disease prevention. Well, can we ever do anything when it comes to the health care When you look and you realize it's the #1 lobbying fund in the United States, beats out communication technology, beats out finance, beats out transportation, even beats out defense. Healthcare industry broadly defined as the health insurance industry, the commercial health insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry. Medicare administrative costs are only 2%. Commercial health insurance costs about 20%. So that means 20 cents out of every dollar you think you're spending on health nationally is going to the commercial insurance industry. For marketing, for advertising, for selling, for profits, for claims adjustment, which often means claims denial. I, for one, see no advantage to the commercial health insurance industry. I think it's a total waste for our country. If we're really serious about health reform, I think we're going to have to deal with that. But no one's talking about it. No one that I'm aware of. None of the health policy experts that write in health affairs. No one is addressing what I think of as the most expensive part of the healthcare industry. Now, we need a new paradigm when it comes to healthcare. When it comes to health research, when I arrived at the National Institutes of Health as a young scientist in 1955, we had a wonderful, iconic, if I can use that word, director who had more or less decided on the disease of the month approach. The Disease Mission Institutes. Terrific, very successful, based on what I call the health politics of anguish. Cancer Institute, Heart Institute. If a family had diabetes, they could establish a juvenile diabetes foundation. And because each of the institutes at NIH have a direct budgetary line to Congress, which is pretty unique within our government, then these advocacy groups, family members who care deeply about something that happened in their family, could go directly to Congress to labor and lobby on behalf of whatever it might be, an orphan disease perhaps, cancer, heart disease, whatever. I think that's been terrific and very successful. But it's time also that we begin to address the underlying biology of aging. Why does 80% of all cancer occur after 60 years of age? What is it that happens at the molecular and cellular level that predisposes us to aging, disease, and death? So I think we need a new paradigm. And some of us have been writing about this. And I've listed 2 articles here, which we've addressed the issue. And what we would like to see happen is an extraordinary 1%, only 1% of Medicare devoted to the basic biology of aging. And we'd take as a base the year 2005. That would give us $3 billion of new money to go to the biology of aging and the interrelationship of aging and disease, and also a portion would have to go to infrastructure, animal resources, longitudinal studies, research, development, training. But that would be a huge jump, but a very new paradigm that would supplement, not replace, but would supplement the disease approach. So we could begin to understand why these diseases affect us during the course of the life cycle. Why Alzheimer's disease? Why does it begin to hit at the times that it hits? Now, I see my dear friend Tuck Finch in the room, and he may not agree with me, but I'm very worried about the lack of progress with regard to Alzheimer's disease. Everyone's got so wedded to the amyloid hypothesis, although there's no direct relationship between the concentration of amyloid and the degree of intellectual impairment. Now, that might be explainable, but it does concern me. And when money gets tight at the NIH, from my experience there, study sections get very conservative. And so the Taoists, who are the people that think tau is important, and the Baptists, the people who think amyloid is important, are not as apt to hear a new cockamamie idea that might come down the pike. And that worries me, because while we may find success with some of the efforts now in the pharmaceutical companies to dissolve amyloid or to find ways to prevent its coming into place to begin with, supposing that's not the way it comes out, I think we need to have a richer portfolio of ideas and work in such a devastating condition. There's an estimate now that we have 4.5 million people with Alzheimer's. When the baby boomers reach Golden Pond, when it gets up to 2020, 2030, we could have between 14 and 16 million people with Alzheimer's disease if we do not make progress in either prevention or treatment. It's staggering to imagine. We only have 1.5 million people in nursing homes. We have 16,000 nursing homes. Where would we put 14 to 16 million people? How would we be able to afford it? We've got to have a major strategy. And by extension, I think it has to go beyond Alzheimer's disease. It has to include Parkinson's disease. As a clinician, having worked in nursing homes, there are many neurological conditions we don't even understand that patients have in these homes. So there's a whole world of neurodegeneration we must address. We had the decade of the brain, which was an important step in providing new resources for work in neurodegeneration and neuroscience. I think we need a century of the brain. I mean, it's so complex. It's the most complex organ in our body. How are we to understand schizophrenia, let alone dementia? We really need new and vitally important resources as a protection for the health and productivity of this nation. Now, I mentioned the issue, can we afford old age? And I just want to bring to your attention some very interesting work from economists of very diverse backgrounds. The more conservative University of Chicago's Department of Economics, the Rand Institution here, Yale, Harvard, our own center, Belfast, work that contradicts the usual perceived wisdom or received wisdom. That we all understand that as countries become wealthier, they're in a better position to provide resources for their citizens, assuming they're a benevolent government. But that the reverse is true, that as societies become more longevous and healthier, wealth is generated is a relatively new idea, attributable to the institutions I just mentioned. But very important because it says a lot about the idea that we can't afford old age. For example, Bloom and Canning of Harvard, originally Canning was from Belfast, have studied nations that have a 5-year difference in life expectancy, and finding that those that have an increased life expectancy over other nations have a greater and more rapid gross domestic product. Striking findings. I quote you from Science magazine just 3 years ago, in about February. So the idea that we are going to be confronted by economic stagnation as a result of increased longevity and population aging is questionable. There are two mechanisms by which this might have happened. One, I would cite the work of James Smith, an economist here at the Rand Institute, in which he follows cohort-wise an individual who's had a healthy childhood. And with a healthy childhood, they're more apt to have had a healthy adulthood. And if they have a healthy adulthood, they're more apt to have a better job. And they're more apt, therefore, to have saved more and invested more, and are more likely to have a productive old age. So that health throughout the course of life is clearly related to the generation of wealth. And of course, if you add up individuals collectively, that would be one mechanism as how health and longevity can contribute to wealth. But the second, of course, is what the Japanese like to call the silver industries. We often call the senior market. You all remember the 1960s, the youth market, and how attractive that was to business. And of course, as we know, one person's cost is another person's job, asset, and we see now how the green industries are beginning to emerge. So we have in the silver industries, or the mature market, financial services, although that certainly has been in the descent in recent months, legal services, healthcare. The only sector of our economy today that's generating new jobs is the healthcare sector. The only sector in American business today that's generating new jobs. Housing, living arrangements, travel, and hospitality. Then I mentioned at the outset the fear that we would be led to intergenerational conflicts. I only know 2 countries where there have been studies undertaken, France and the U.S. But in neither country has it been demonstrated that there are such hostile relations across the generations. I think we could make it happen if we push hard enough and write enough scandal stories about how children are being mistreated or whatever. But at least so far, most people are positive towards Social Security and Medicare for their older people in our society. Now, I personally think that Medicare, only being for older people, does kind of invite the possible problem, because middle-aged younger people are left holding the bag. 50 million people without health insurance, and many more that can no longer afford the premiums, and many who've had to be forced into bankruptcy as a consequence of inadequate health care coverage. So it is a serious possibility, but at least so far we don't have it happening. Well, let me conclude by saying that science is not going to stop. It's going to move on. We're going to have massive contributions from the world of genomics, gene-based medicine. That, by the way, will do a lot to answer that question of the deaths from drugs, because if we're able to match a particular medication with a particular individual, we can dramatically reduce the deaths that come about as a result of the mismatch. There are some 80 antihypertensive medications on the market, for example. So while one might cause a problem with a particular patient, another one might not cause any problem at all. But we need to have pharmacogenomics or personalized medicine, which will come, I think, within the next 10 or 15 years, which will do a lot to deal with that problem. We're also going to have the advances of regenerative medicine. Here California has been in the lead in terms of the establishment of efforts to look at embryonic stem cell technology. But think of the possibilities of being able to replace vet cells, cells in the brain that are responsible for Parkinsonism. If we're able to deal with the pancreas and the loss of cells there that relate to diabetes, if we're able to replace retinal cells as a result of the number one cause of visual loss in older people, macular degeneration, if we're able to replace cells, tissues, and maybe even organs, what a dramatic difference it will be. So I think the 21st century, we're going to see dramatic changes and further increases of life. But I worry a lot about our baby boomers, 76 million strong. Before today's out, another 12,000 will turn 63. 2 years from now, they'll be getting Social Security. In 2025, they're going to make up 25% of all adults, 20% of the entire population, 1 out of every 5 Americans. They're not prepared. They're less prepared now than ever. Even before this down drop, only half had 401ks, and the half that did had on average $40,000 in their 401ks. Lord knows where they are now. We have not developed genetic medicine in the United States, so who's going to properly take care of people as they get older? We haven't developed the kind of living arrangements that would make it more feasible for people to really live at their own homes. Universal housing, for example, that John and I were discussing this morning. We are just not prepared. The baby boomers are not prepared. They are not healthy. We think of them as out there running and exercising and dieting. But the truth is, the reason we're the healthiest nation in the world is the baby boomers. All you have to do is go to the midsection of the country in the South, and you'll see it in a minute. You may not see it in California, you may not see it in New York, but you see it in mid-America, the huge weight and girth of Americans. And they're baby boomers. So they're not personally healthy either. And yet here they are, about to usher themselves into old age. So my summary thought is that we will get over it. I'm always an optimist. But at the same time, we have some sobering realities to confront, and in particular at the moment, the baby boomer generation, which I regard as a generation at risk. And I know that the Andrews Center is going to do a lot to help contribute to resolving the issues that confront them. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions.
Did I do okay? Yep, 15 till.
Right on target.
Yes, you mentioned, you felt there's a shortcoming in the medical profession having to do with preventive care. And I wondered if you can pick up a bit from dentistry. That about 40 years ago or so, there was an education, a public education about taking care of your oral condition, and even fluoridation perhaps was a contributing factor. But we saw about 20 years ago there was an oversupply of dentists. So therefore there was an effective program in the background. And the same thing with periodontists, the people who cut gums, and they typically were working with elderly people. But training 20 or 30 years ago taught people, what, you can floss your teeth. So I'm wondering, is there not some way that medical professions should be picking up on what seems to have been successful, well, in a certain sense, successful to the dentistry profession. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think, when I first saw older people in 1955, as a young scientist, believe it or not, half of older Americans, meaning 65 and above, had no teeth. So you're absolutely right. There's been dramatic, remarkable change in these 53 years. Extraordinary. Dentistry deserves a lot of credit for it, and certainly periodontal disease is actually osteoporosis, but in the gums. So through research and better understanding of osteoporosis, we could also make a difference. I think you're quite right. There must be some ways, I'm not sure I know exactly what they would be, to translate the history of dentistry and the great improvement in oral health in America and have that translate to the body as a whole.
Would it be of help, this is suggested, in one's annual physical exam, let's say, that the doctor not be there trying to advise you of ways to prevent possible difficulties? Would that be a way to approach this?
Well, the annual physical's not necessarily our best means. And I think the doctor-patient relationship is too short now, about 12 minutes for each person. I think we need more public health approach to dealing with prevention and with health promotion. I mean, a really broad way. For example, we have 15,000 so-called senior centers in the United States. Many of these senior centers are not well attended. Many people don't even like the term senior center, and they won't go. And they're very passive in general. You can play bingo and so forth. They should be modernized and transformed. They should become vital health promotion disease prevention centers, teaching people how to do squats, for example, so that they have a strong quadriceps, which is the number one predictor of frailty in old age. And, falls are the number 12 cause of death in this country among people over 65. We could make senior centers real centers of health promotion. We could also get people off their, and contributing to the community. They don't have to sit around and play bingo. They could actually participate with kids in after-school enrichment programs or whatever. I think we really need to modernize. We have to modernize older people. We have to modernize senior centers.
I was just going to suggest, it seems to me the conclusion from your talk is we should move that education to preschools and to get people started understanding the long-term. I was going to suggest we should move that education to preschool and get people understanding the long-term consequences of their lifetime choices, because an awful lot of what you describe, you can't reverse it at 65. You need to have prevented it at 25 and 35.
The longer I've been in the field of aging, the more I think in life course terms, lifespan terms. So many of the issues of old age, as I mentioned in my comments, are related to the very beginnings of life itself. So we've got to help kids, and I think preschool is as good a time as any. How do we get them to not eat pizzas and hamburgers and French fries? That's a challenge for all of you.
Dr. Butler, when you got me a little worried there when you said that health insurance is just terrible. What do you think about
commercial health insurance?
Yes. What do you think of life insurance? I just bought life insurance. I thought, oh, Dr. Butler's going to say I shouldn't have done that.
No, I don't have any problem with life insurance.
I'm a little concerned about what we have planned for lunch.
I'll be on you, Jerry.
Sure.
Dr. Butler, I'm a geriatric nurse trying to do my bit to prepare the healthcare workforce, but I'm very intrigued by some of these new models I see like the caring collaborative, also the emergence of housing alternatives. Dr. Pineus could probably speak to this more, but intentional communities where, for those of us who don't have children like myself, I think there is a promising future if we begin to think in innovative ways. I'm curious, am I too optimistic on this?
Yes, I am. I'm very much struck by you're probably familiar with the Beacon Hill Village in Boston. And there are other programs. And as I mentioned, we should be doing something about the 15,000 senior centers. We should be doing something with the 5,000 naturally occurring retirement communities, or NORCs. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, in Beacon Hill in Boston, which is relatively affluent, they decided that they would form a 501c3, which is a nonprofit corporation, that they would prearrange before they got into trouble for repair services if something went wrong with their plumbing or whatever. They would also have medical services arranged ahead of time, home health aides, and so forth. And they even set up a fund if somebody ran out of money that would be able to provide some support for an individual member of their community. And now New Canaan, Connecticut, and many other places are adopting this kind of model, which I think is a very attractive model. And I like it because it's sort of spontaneous from the people, from below rather than imposed on top. And but there are also co-local housing. There are a whole lot of new imaginative ways of trying to create. John, of course, very interested, as he should be, in universal housing, although he was pointing out to me this morning that sadly there aren't any real major builders that are doing it yet. A little bit more in Europe, he said. But it would be wonderful if we built housing from the beginning that would fit our life course needs, not just at our younger age or whatever, but throughout life. Doc.
As always, you give a tour de force. Bob, could you speculate on how we could get geriatric medical training back on course, and what the role of other allied health professions could be in geriatric care?
I've actually never favored the idea of our having a new, possibly expensive and self-interested practice specialty of geriatrics. I have thought that we should capitalize on those that are already in medicine. And what we really need within every medical school is an academic group of geriatricians who would make sure that no one graduated from medical school or any residency program, whatever their specialty, without knowing the special issues of aging, the problems of pharmacy, problems that you can have a heart attack and no chest pain but can have intellectual confusion, that you can have hyperthyroidism and be apathetic instead of agitated. There's so many things to be taught, and I think that we should teach them so that we would be able to go to the primary care doctor, go to the gastroenterologist,
Gut guy.
and know that they would know something about old age. So that's my view, and we do have in place in the United States, under a section of our government, under the Public Health Service, called HRSA, which means the Health Resources and Services Administration. And they have a program called the Geriatric Academic Career Award, or GACA. And that would go a long way, if built and was more generous, to solving the problem. But it's very modest, and it's not able to really provide what we need. And what we ultimately need is about 10 academic teachers in every one of the 145 medical schools. That would only mean 1,450 doctors out of some 700,000 doctors in the country. And so I had my economists in my center. I should say something about what my center is, by the way. In my center, an economist who calculated an algorithm that I could bring to Congress, which I did. And the algorithm took into account a 16% loss because the person really didn't like geriatrics once they got into it, or they died, or whatever. And what we would need by 2022 to have in place 10 hardcore academic teachers in every one of the 145 medical schools. It wouldn't cost much. It's like a decibel point in our federal budget, about $22 to $26 million a year. That's all it would cost. The other choice would be Medicare itself, which does provide graduate medical education for all specialties, and not anything to speak of for geriatrics, ironically, even though Medicare presumably had something to do with older people. But it provides only 1-year fellowship. It should provide not only a 2-year fellowship, but an opportunity for academic career development so we could have in place those 10 people. That's not going to happen overnight. That's why I despair the boomers getting proper protection soon, because to have a teacher, they have to have their 3 years of internal medicine or their family practice. Then they have to have a 2-year fellowship in geriatrics. Then they have to have several years of academic teaching in order to really be qualified. Well, that's already 5 or 6 years on top of your medical school. And we're, just a few years away from when the baby boomers hit their maximum. So it's a problem, a real problem. And write your congressman, write Henry Waxman, whatever, and let's see what we can get accomplished.
Following up on that, the other way to start looking at it, and it would be very difficult, I fully understand, but it also deals with your point earlier of the medical specialties being vastly differently reimbursed.
Right.
So one approach is for Medicare and Medicaid to stop doing that and to start reimbursing based on time, based on value, not just procedures. Now, I know how hard that would be, but on the other hand, if we don't ask for it at some point, we won't get it.
You're right. I worked for what was called the Physician Payment Review Commission. I worked for Congress between 1985 and 1989. And that was our job, was to think through how we could alter reimbursements. And we had what was called the resource-based relative value scale. And the concept was that we would find ways to provide those who provide cognitive, evaluative, management aspects better than had been in the past, but it had to be done in a neutral, budget-neutral manner. So that meant we would have to cut the ophthalmologists, the surgeons. Well, believe me, everything we recommended didn't work because the specialty groups were down in Congress in a flash. So I think we got a modest cut in cataract extraction, but that's about all we accomplished. So I agree with you completely, but it's very, very tough to do. I don't know. I think, in retrospect, I wish I had suggested something like the British system, where at least they pay the geriatrician more for every additional 5 years of life. So in other words, you get a certain payment up to 65, then 65 to 69, then 70 to 74, because that also would preclude any shenanigans on the part of doctors, and they can undertake shenanigans too, in claiming they spent more time with the patient, whereas if it was more broad-brushed, you'd get X amount of dollars more for seeing older patients. That might help. But you're right, but I don't see an easy solution.
We have time for one more question.
Isn't it more, time for a more perfect world where we could go for a single payer system instead of the mess that you have in Medicare Part D and Medicare in general, and what we've gone through, even through the younger people going through insurance?
Well, my sly way of answering yes is to say that we don't need the commercial health insurance industry. Because if we have single payer, but rather than call for the single payer system, which everybody says is socialism and so forth, I'd rather just brutally attack the commercial health insurance industry.
But how do you set them all out to work?
And the other thing I like to remind people is we've had socialized medicine in the United States since the 1920s. It's called the Veterans Administration, where doctors work directly for the government. It has the best electronic system in terms of patient care of any system in the United States. And it hasn't led to the end of our republic.
Dr. Butler, can you tell us a little bit about what your International Longevity Center is focusing on right now? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't do a very good job promoting my own organization. We are endeavoring to address the huge problem of the impact of population aging and its implications upon society. We have 10 centers around the world, 4 in the developing world, University of Cape Town, South Africa, India, Argentina. In the developed world in France, Great Britain, Japan, Israel, the Netherlands. We are about to have Singapore, we think the Czech Republic. We're working with China and with Australia. I don't know how many more we want because we can get top-heavy. And that could be disadvantageous. Since we've gotten more courage recently, we actually charge kind of a franchise to join our club. And that makes it possible for us to hire a fabulous secretariat who helps organize symposia, research studies, and the like. So our objective, quite simply, as I said, is take a century to do. But how do we finance longevity? How do we now that we know people are living longer, how do we maintain their health and quality of life? And how do we overcome ageism or prejudice? Because at the heart of so much is prejudice. And the cousin of prejudice, denial, where we pretend we're not going to get old. And therefore we don't want to think about this other inconvenient truth, namely the reality of aging.
One of the, before I thank Dr. Butler, to be shamelessly self-promoting for the school, but your comments, your response to Tuck's question with regard to geriatric medicine brings to mind, as a parent and as an educator and as right now dean of a school of gerontology, the idea of undergraduates not having exposure to lifespan development and aging in this period of time seems undesirable to me. And we try to encourage and reach out to the undergraduates at large at USC to understand the importance, both for scientific purposes, because it's intellectually fascinating, but also for practical and societal purposes, the merits of this kind of lifespan approach. As indeed well pointed out, it's not simply the study of older people, but forces in developmental processes over time. So that's sort of something that we talk about a lot among the faculty. So with that, if you'll pardon that brief commercial, with that I want to thank you most cordially, and those of you who pre-registered, whatever, invited to break some bread with us out in the courtyard. I hope it's not too cold out there. Thank you very much.